Sometimes the way you treat a stranger says more about you than anything money ever could. The low hum of conversation floated through the polished marble halls of Westfield Plaza, where glass storefronts shimmered under soft golden lighting and the scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air like a quiet status symbol. And right in the center of it all stood Sophia Bennett, clutching a thin folder of resumes against her chest, her fingers slightly trembling as she glanced at her reflection in a mirrored pillar. Her blazer was clean but worn at the sleeves, her heels just a little too scuffed to belong in a place like this. And for a second she hesitated, whispering under her breath, "Just one interview, just one chance," before stepping forward into the crowd. She barely made it 10 steps before the atmosphere shifted, a ripple of tension cutting through the calm as voices rose near the entrance of a high-end boutique, and Sophia turned instinctively, her brows knitting together as she saw a man being surrounded by 2 security guards, his coat faded, his hair unkempt, his posture tired but not aggressive, just worn down, and one of the guards spoke sharply, loud enough for nearby shoppers to pause and stare. "Sir, you've been asked to leave. You can't stay here." While a small crowd gathered, murmurs spreading like wildfire, judgment already written across their faces, and the man lifted his hand slightly, not in protest but in quiet confusion. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice calm but strained, and something about the way he said it, simple, honest, almost resigned, made Sophia's chest tighten. She should have kept walking. She knew that. This wasn't her problem. She had an interview in less than 20 minutes. She couldn't afford trouble, not today of all days. But her feet didn't move. Instead, she found herself stepping closer, heart pounding, her voice cutting through the noise before she could second-guess it. "Wait," she said, louder than she expected, and suddenly all eyes turned to her, including his, those tired eyes flickering with surprise. "You're accusing him without proof?" She continued, her grip tightening on the folder as one of the guards frowned, clearly irritated. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he replied. But Sophia shook her head, a nervous breath escaping her lips as she pushed forward anyway. "It does if you're humiliating someone for no reason." And for a moment the entire space seemed to pause, the polished world of wealth and quiet judgment disrupted by one voice that didn't quite belong there. A woman nearby scoffed under her breath. Another man glanced at his watch as if this inconvenience offended him personally. But Sophia didn't back down, even as she felt the weight of their stares pressing in, even as a flicker of doubt crept into her chest, reminding her of everything she stood to lose. Because right now, standing in front of her, was someone who looked like he had already lost enough, and she couldn't just walk away from that. Not today, not ever. And the man watched her in silence, something unreadable passing through his expression, something deeper than gratitude, something closer to disbelief, as if he hadn't expected anyone, least of all someone like her, to stand between him and the world that had already decided who he was. The guard's expression hardened for a moment, but the shift in the crowd was undeniable, whispers replacing certainty, doubt creeping into faces that had just seconds ago looked so sure. And after a brief pause, one of the guards exhaled and stepped back, lowering his voice as if suddenly aware of the attention. "Fine, sir, but we are watching you." And just like that, the tension dissolved. The invisible verdict against the man quietly withdrawn without apology, and the crowd began to scatter. People returning to their shopping bags and polished conversations as if nothing had happened, as if a man's dignity had not just been weighed and almost discarded in front of them. Sophia stood there for a second longer, her heart still racing, the adrenaline slowly fading as reality crept back in, and then she remembered the time, her interview, the one thing she could not afford to mess up, and she looked down at her folder, the edges slightly bent from how tightly she had been holding it. "I am sorry," she muttered under her breath, not entirely sure who she was apologizing to, before turning to leave. But a quiet voice stopped her. "You did not have to do that." And she turned back to see him standing there, the man everyone had just dismissed, his expression softer now, almost thoughtful, and for a moment she noticed details she had not before, the way he held himself, not defensive, not bitter, just composed in a way that did not quite match the image people had assigned to him. "Yes, I did," she replied simply, adjusting the strap of her bag. her voice steadier than she felt. No one deserves to be treated like that. And he studied her for a second, as if trying to understand something deeper than her words, something about why she had stepped in when it cost her something, when it risked everything she had come here for. You could have lost your opportunity, he said quietly, his gaze flicking briefly to the folder in her hands. And Sophia let out a small breath, a half laugh that carried more exhaustion. Then humor. I might have, she admitted, but I would not be able to sit in that interview pretending I did not see what just happened. And there was a silence that followed, not awkward, just heavy with something unspoken. And then she glanced at the time again, her stomach tightening. I really have to go, she said quickly, already stepping backward. Good luck, he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, calm, certain, like it meant more than a casual wish, but she did not have time to think about it. She turned and walked fast, then faster, weaving through the crowd, her heels clicking against the polished floor as the reality of her situation pressed in harder with every step. 10 minutes later, she stood outside a glass office suite on the second level, smoothing down her blazer, trying to steady her breathing. But before she could even knock, the receptionist looked up with a tight, practiced smile. You are Sophia Bennett, correct? And Sophia nodded, hope flickering for just a second. Yes, I am here for the interview. But the woman's smile did not change, did not soften. I am sorry, but we have decided to move forward with other candidates. And the words landed heavier than she expected, her fingers tightening slightly around her folder. But my interview was scheduled for today, she said, confusion creeping into her voice. And the receptionist hesitated just long enough to make it clear this was not a misunderstanding. There was a note added to your file, she said carefully, about an incident downstairs. And just like that, Sophia understood. The moment she had chosen to speak up, now quietly closing the door she had hoped would open. And for a second she stood there, the noise of the mall muffled behind the glass, her reflection faintly staring back at her, and she swallowed, forcing a small nod. I understand, she said, even though she did not fully, not yet. But she turned anyway, walking away with steady steps, because stopping now would mean letting it break her, and she was not ready to do that, not even close. Outside, the air felt different, cooler somehow, or maybe it was just the weight in Sophia's chest settling deeper as she stepped out of the building and into the late afternoon light. The noise of traffic and distant conversations blending into a dull hum that she barely registered, her heels slowing against the pavement until she finally stopped near a row of metal benches, her fingers loosening around the folder as she sat down, staring at the slightly wrinkled pages inside as if they might suddenly change their mind and offer her a different ending. But they did not, and after a moment she let out a quiet breath, tilting her head back to look at the sky between the tall buildings, blinking quickly to keep her composure intact, because she had promised herself a long time ago that she would not fall apart in public, not where anyone could see. A few minutes passed before she leaned forward again, smoothing out the edges of her resume with careful, almost automatic movements, as if fixing the paper could somehow fix everything else. And then she reached into her bag, pulling out a small granola bar, unwrapping it slowly, taking a bite more out of necessity than hunger, her mind replaying the moment upstairs, the polite smile, the quiet rejection, the implication that doing the right thing had somehow made her the wrong choice. And she shook her head slightly, whispering under her breath, "You still did the right thing," as if she needed to hear it out loud to believe it. Across the street, a sleek black car idled at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the city around it. And inside, Alexander Reed sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the woman across from him. The same woman who had stepped into a situation everyone else had avoided. The same woman who had just walked away from an opportunity because she refused to ignore something unjust. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself unsettled, not by numbers or negotiations or market shifts, but by something far less predictable, something human. And beside him, his assistant, Daniel Morris, glanced at the tablet in his hand before speaking carefully. "Sir, the board meeting is in 40 minutes. But Alexander did not respond immediately, his attention still on Sophia as she sat alone, quietly. Gathering herself, she lost the position, Daniel added after a brief pause, his tone neutral but observant, and Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to realization. Because of what happened downstairs, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. And Daniel nodded once. It appears so. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the city continuing around them as if nothing had shifted, but inside the car, something had, something subtle but undeniable. Alexander leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the leather armrest before stilling. Find out everything about her, he said finally, his voice calm but firm, and Daniel looked up, surprised for just a fraction of a second before nodding again, already making a note. Yes, sir. And as the car pulled away from the curb, blending back into traffic, Alexander's gaze lingered on the spot where she had been sitting, as if committing the moment to memory, not because it was part of some calculated test, but because it had caught him off guard in a way he had not expected. And across the street, Sophia stood up, brushing off her blazer, lifting her chin slightly as she slipped the folder back into her bag, her steps steady once more as she walked forward, not knowing that the moment she had thought closed a door had, in fact, opened something far bigger, something neither of them could yet fully see. That night, the city felt louder than usual, or maybe it was just the way Sophia heard it now. Every passing car, every distant siren, every muffled conversation outside her small apartment window layering over the quiet space she sat in. Her shoes kicked off near the door, her bag resting against the wall as she leaned back on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling with tired eyes, replaying the day in fragments that refused to settle. The moment she spoke up, the looks from strangers, the polite rejection upstairs, and she let out a slow breath, pressing her fingers lightly against her temples as if she could quiet the thoughts by force. But they lingered, circling back to the same question she had been avoiding, whether doing the right thing was always supposed to feel this costly. And after a moment she sat up, reaching for her bag, pulling out the folder once more, flipping through the pages even though she knew them by heart. Every line, every bullet point, every carefully chosen word meant to prove she was worth a chance. And yet none of it had mattered when it counted. None of it had outweighed a single moment of standing up for someone else. And she swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. You did not lose everything. As if reminding herself that tomorrow still existed, even if it did not look the way she had planned. Across town, high above the city in a glass-walled office overlooking miles of glowing lights, Alexander Reed stood near the window, his reflection faint against the skyline as he listened to the quiet hum of the room. The meeting had ended 20 minutes ago, the board members long gone, but he had not moved, his mind still fixed on something far removed from quarterly reports or expansion strategies. And behind him, Daniel Morris stepped forward, placing a slim file on the desk. I have what you asked for, he said, his tone measured. And Alexander turned slightly, his gaze shifting from the city to the folder. Sophia Bennett, Daniel continued, 26, currently working part-time jobs, no major financial support, consistent employment history, no disciplinary issues. And there was a brief pause before he added, she has been applying to entry-level positions across multiple firms for the past 3 months. And Alexander walked over slowly, opening the file, his eyes scanning the details not as data points, but as pieces of a person he had seen choose integrity over convenience. Why was she flagged? He asked, already knowing the answer. And Daniel exhaled lightly. The incident at the plaza was reported by one of the store managers. They described her as disruptive. And the word lingered in the air for a second, sharp and misplaced, and Alexander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not anger, but something colder, more deliberate. Disruptive, he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of it. And then he closed the file, his fingers resting against the cover for a moment before he looked up, his voice steady. Schedule her for an interview. And Daniel hesitated, just slightly. With which department? He asked, and Alexander did not look away. With me? He said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything else in the room. And Daniel nodded, already understanding that this was not routine, not another candidate in a long list, but something different, something personal in a way Alexander rarely allowed. Tomorrow morning? Daniel asked, and Alexander shook his head once. No, he said, his gaze returning briefly to the city lights before settling again. Give her time to think. She lost everything first. And there was no cruelty in the statement, only a quiet certainty that the timing would matter, that the moment would mean more because of what came before it. And as Daniel left the office to make the arrangements, Alexander remained where he was, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. And for the first time in a long time, the decisions ahead of him felt less about strategy and more about something far less predictable, something he could not measure or control. And somewhere across the city, Sophia finally closed her folder, setting it aside as she lay back against her pillow, her eyes slowly drifting shut, unaware that the story she thought had ended that afternoon was only just beginning. The next morning came quietly, almost deceptively calm, sunlight slipping through the thin curtains of Sophia's apartment as if nothing had changed, as if the weight of yesterday had not followed her into today. And for a moment she lay still, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling, letting reality settle in slowly instead of all at once, because getting up meant facing it again, the rejection, the uncertainty, the silence from every application she had sent out. And yet after a few seconds she exhaled, pushing herself upright, her feet touching the cold floor as she reached for the same worn blazer hanging on the back of a chair, smoothing it out with practiced hands, not because it was perfect, but because it was all she had, and she refused to let that define her. The city was already alive by the time she stepped outside, the rhythm of people rushing to work, taxis weaving through traffic, the scent of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, pulling her in without much thought. And she stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around her as she joined the short line, her fingers instinctively checking the small amount of cash in her wallet, calculating what she could afford. And when it was her turn, she ordered the simplest thing on the menu, a small black coffee. No extras, no indulgence, just enough to get through the morning. And as she waited, her mind drifted, not to what she had lost, but to what she still needed to do, the next application, the next chance, the next step forward, because stopping was not an option. Behind her, the door opened again, a soft chime cutting through the low murmur of conversation, and a man stepped in, his presence quiet but steady, wearing the same worn coat, the same unassuming appearance that had made him invisible to most people, but not to her. And for a second Sophia did not notice, focused on her thoughts, until a familiar voice spoke just a few feet away, "Good morning." And she turned, her eyes widening slightly in recognition, before softening, a small, surprised smile forming despite everything. "You again," she said, her tone light but genuine, as if seeing him grounded something in her that the rest of the world had shaken. And he nodded, returning the smile. "I was hoping I might run into you," he replied, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, and she let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly. "I hope today is treating you better than yesterday," she said, half teasing, half sincere, and he tilted his head, just slightly, as if considering the question more deeply than expected. "It is different," he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that lingered for a moment, subtle but noticeable, before the barista called her name, breaking the pause, and she stepped forward to grab her coffee, wrapping her hands around the warm cup as she turned back toward him. "Do you want one?" she asked suddenly, the offer coming naturally, without hesitation, and for a brief second, he seemed almost caught off guard. "You do not have to do that," he said, echoing words from the day before, and she smiled faintly, lifting the cup slightly. "I know," she replied, "but I can." And there was no grand gesture in it, no expectation, just a simple extension of the same kindness she had shown before. And after a moment, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, and as she stepped back to the counter to place another order, Alexander Reed watched her, not as a test this time, not as an observation, to be measured, but as something real unfolding in front of him, something he had not planned. And as she returned, handing him the coffee with a small shrug, "It is not much, but it helps," she said, her voice steady, and he accepted it carefully, his fingers brushing the warm cup as if it carried more weight than it should. "Thank you, Sophia," he said, using her name for the first time, and she blinked, surprised. "I do not remember telling you my name," she replied, her brows lifting slightly, curiosity replacing the ease of the moment. And for a fraction of a second, Something shifted in his expression, something that hinted at a truth not yet revealed. Before he answered, calm but deliberate, "You mentioned it yesterday," and she hesitated, searching her memory, uncertain. But before she could press further, her phone buzzed in her bag, the sharp vibration pulling her attention away, and when she pulled it out, her breath caught just slightly at the unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. A message waiting, simple and direct, asking if she would be available for an interview. And for a moment the noise of the cafe faded, her world narrowing to that single line. The possibility it carried, and she looked up again, instinctively. But the man standing in front of her was already watching, his expression unreadable, as if he already knew what that message meant before she did. Sophia's fingers tightened slightly around her phone as she read the message again, her eyes scanning the words as if they might disappear if she blinked too quickly. An interview. Today, a real opportunity. And for a moment she just stood there, caught between disbelief and cautious hope, the noise of the cafe slowly returning around her as her heartbeat picked up, and she swallowed, glancing up instinctively at the man in front of her. This is an interview request," she said, her voice softer now, almost uncertain, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it less real, and he nodded slightly, his expression calm but attentive. "That is good news," he replied, and she let out a small breath, half laugh, shaking her head just a little. "It is. I just did not expect anything this fast," she admitted, her thumb hovering over the screen, hesitating for a second before typing a quick response to confirm, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she did not want to make a mistake this time. And when she finished, she slipped the phone back into her bag, her shoulders lifting just slightly, as if something inside her had realigned, even if only a little. "I guess I should not question it," she added, glancing back at him with a faint smile. And he held her gaze for a moment, something thoughtful passing through his eyes. "Sometimes things come at the right moment," he said quietly, and there was a subtle weight to his words that she did not fully understand. But she nodded anyway, taking another sip of her coffee before stepping back. "I should go prepare," she said, already shifting into motion, because this was what she had been waiting for, what she had been working toward, and she was not going to risk being late or unprepared again, not when this could change everything. "Good luck, Sophia," he said, and this time she did not question how he knew her name. She simply smiled, more certain now. "Thank you," she replied, before turning and walking out of the cafe, the morning air hitting her face as she stepped back into the city, her pace quicker, her posture straighter, as if hope itself had given her momentum. Across the street, a black car waited once more, and as she disappeared into the flow of pedestrians, Alexander Reed stepped out of the cafe a few seconds later, his expression composed, the warmth of the coffee still in his hand, but his thoughts already moving ahead. And when he reached the car, Daniel Morris opened the door, glancing at him briefly. "She accepted?" Daniel asked, though the answer was already evident, and Alexander gave a small nod, sliding into the seat. "She did," he said, his tone even, and Daniel closed the door before moving to the driver's side. "The interview is set for noon at headquarters," he added as he started the engine, and Alexander leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting to the passing streets outside. "Make sure she is not informed about who she is meeting," he said after a moment, his voice steady, and Daniel glanced at him through the rearview mirror, understanding immediately. "You want the reveal to happen in person," he said, and Alexander did not respond right away, his eyes briefly reflecting the movement of the city before he spoke. "I want to see if she stays the same when she walks into a different room," he replied, and there was no calculation in his tone, no cold detachment, only a quiet curiosity that had not been there before. Hours later, Sophia stood in front of the towering glass building that housed Reed Global Holdings, her reflection staring back at her once again, but this time her grip on her folder was steadier, her shoulders squared as she took a slow breath, reminding herself that this was just another interview, just another chance, even if something about it felt different, something she could not quite explain. And as the door slid open, welcoming her inside, she stepped forward without hesitation, unaware that the man she had defended, the man she had shared coffee with just hours earlier, was already waiting for her on the other side. and that everything she thought she understood about this opportunity was about to change in a way she could never have expected. The lobby of Reed Global Holdings felt impossibly vast, the kind of space designed to make people pause without realizing it. With polished stone floors stretching beneath high ceilings and soft lighting reflecting off glass walls that seemed to go on forever, and as Sophia stepped inside, her heels echoed faintly with each step, a subtle reminder of where she was, a place far removed from the small offices and crowded cafes she was used to. And for a brief moment she hesitated, her fingers tightening around her folder as she took it all in, the quiet confidence of employees moving with purpose, the receptionist's poised smile, the subtle hum of a world that operated at a different level. But she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself, reminding herself that she had earned the right to be here, that this was just another interview, just another conversation. "Good afternoon," the receptionist greeted, her tone warm but professional. "You must be Sophia Bennett." And Sophia nodded, offering a small, polite smile. "Yes, I am here for the interview." And the receptionist gestured toward a seating area. "Please have a seat. Someone will come for you shortly." And Sophia thanked her before walking over, sitting carefully on the edge of a sleek chair, her posture straight, her eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on her hands, smoothing the edges of her folder again, a quiet habit that grounded her more than anything else. Minutes passed slowly, each second, stretching just enough for doubt to try and slip back in. But she kept it at bay, focusing instead on what she would say, how she would present herself, until finally a voice called her name, and she looked up to see a well-dressed assistant standing a few feet away. "Ms. Bennett, please follow me," he said, and she stood quickly, nodding as she fell into step beside him, her heart beating just a little faster now as they moved through the building, past glass-walled offices and quiet conference rooms, up a private elevator that opened into a quieter, more secluded floor, one that felt different even without explanation, more exclusive, more deliberate. When they stopped in front of a large set of double doors, the assistant turned slightly, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You may go in," he said, before stepping aside, and Sophia took a breath, her hand hovering for just a second before she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office beyond was expansive but understated, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline in a way that made everything outside seem smaller, distant. And at the far end of the room, behind a sleek desk, stood a man adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, his posture straight, his presence commanding without effort. And for a moment Sophia did not recognize him, the contrast too stark, too unexpected. But then he turned, and everything shifted. The worn coat was gone, replaced by sharp lines and quiet authority, the tired image replaced by something unmistakable, something powerful. And her breath caught just slightly as recognition hit all at once. The cafe, the plaza, the quiet voice that had thanked her. And now this, the same man, standing in a completely different world, watching her with the same steady gaze. "Good afternoon, Sophia," Alexander Reed said, his voice calm, familiar in a way that made the moment even more surreal. And she stood frozen for a fraction of a second, her mind trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she thought she knew. "You," she began, her voice trailing off as the realization fully settled in, and he inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging the unspoken question between them. "Yes," he replied simply, leaving no room for doubt, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with the weight of everything she had not known, everything he had chosen not to reveal. And Sophia felt something shift inside her, not just surprise, but something deeper, a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and the faint edge of something else she could not yet name, as she stood there in the center of a room that suddenly felt very different from the one she had walked into just moments before. The silence stretched just long enough to feel heavy, not awkward, but undeniable, as Sophia stood there trying to steady her breathing, her mind replaying every moment from the past 24 hours with a new clarity that made everything sharper, louder, more complicated. And she finally took a small step forward, her grip tightening around the folder as her voice found its way out. "You knew," she said, not accusing, not yet, but searching, and Alexander did not look away, his expression calm but no longer distant. "I knew who you were," he answered, his tone even, and something in that quiet honesty made the truth land harder than if he had tried to soften it. And she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, shaking her head slightly as she processed it. "So the cafe, yesterday, that was not a coincidence," she continued, her voice steadier now. And he paused for just a fraction of a second before replying, "No." And the simplicity of the word carried weight. Not defensive, not apologetic, just real. And Sophia felt a flicker of something rise in her chest, not anger exactly, but something close, something tied to pride, to the idea that she had been seen before she even knew she was being watched. "Were you testing me?" she asked, her eyes meeting his directly now. And this time Alexander did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly as if choosing his words with care. "At first," he admitted, "yes." And the honesty did not soften the impact, but it grounded it, made it something she could respond to instead of something hidden, and she nodded once, slowly, absorbing it. "And after?" she pressed, her voice quieter now, and he stepped forward just slightly, closing the distance enough to make the moment feel more personal, less like an interview, and more like a conversation. "That mattered. After, I was trying to understand why you did what you did," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity, something genuine that had replaced whatever intention he started with. And Sophia let out a small breath, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. "Because it was the right thing," she replied simply, as if the answer had never been complicated to her, and he nodded, as if that was exactly what he expected her to say. Most people would not have taken that risk, he said, and she gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Most people would have walked away," she corrected gently. And for a moment the room felt smaller, quieter, the distance between their worlds narrowing just enough for something real to exist between them. But then the weight of everything else returned, and she glanced down briefly at the folder in her hands before looking back up, her expression more composed now, more guarded. "So what is this?" she asked, gesturing lightly around. "The office, an interview, or another test?" And the question hung in the air, honest and direct, and Alexander met it without hesitation. "It is an opportunity," he said, his voice steady. "But not because you passed a test," he added, and she watched him carefully, waiting. "It is because you reminded me of something this company has forgotten," he continued, and there was a subtle shift in his tone now, something more personal, less formal, that how we treat people when we think no one is watching matters more than any policy we write. And Sophia felt that land differently. Not as praise, but as recognition of something she had always believed but rarely seen reflected back at her. And for a second she did not speak, letting the words settle, before she asked quietly, "And what does that mean for me?" And Alexander held her gaze, the answer clear before he even said it. "It means I want you here," he replied, not as a favor, not as a reward, but as a decision, one that carried weight beyond the room they were standing in. And for the first time since she walked in, Sophia felt the balance shift, not completely, not yet, but enough to realize that this moment was not about what she had lost the day before, but about what she might be stepping into now, even if she was not entirely sure she was ready for it. Sophia did not answer right away, not because she did not hear him, but because she needed a moment to separate what he was offering from everything that had led to this point. The rejection, the confusion, the quiet realization that she had been observed before she ever stepped into this room. And she took a slow breath, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window behind him where the city stretched endlessly, reminding her just how far apart their worlds had been only hours ago, before she brought her gaze back to him, steady now, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. "I do not want this because you feel like you owe me," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, and Alexander's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, as if he had expected that answer. "I do not," he replied, just as steady. "If anything, I am trying to correct what we almost overlooked." And she studied him for a second longer, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would make this feel like another decision made above her instead of with her. But she did not find it, and slowly, she nodded, not in agreement yet, but in understanding. "Then tell me what this really is," she said, her fingers loosening slightly around the folder as if she no longer needed to hold onto it as tightly, and Alexander walked around the desk, closing the distance between them in a way that felt intentional, not imposing. "It is a role that does not exist yet," he explained, his tone measured, one that focuses on how this company treats people, not just in policy, but in practice, in moments when no one is documenting it. And Sophia felt something shift inside her again, something unexpected, because this was not just a job, it was something larger, something that aligned with what she had stood for without even thinking about it. And she let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh of disbelief. "You are creating a position because of one moment," she said, and he shook his head slightly. "No," he corrected, "because that moment showed me what we have been missing for years, and the weight of that settled between them, not as pressure, but as possibility." She looked down briefly at the folder in her hands, then slowly closed it, the sound soft but final, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her expression, not hesitation, but choice. "If I say yes," she began, her voice steady, "then I am not here because I was tested, or because I happened to be in the right place at the right time." And Alexander met her gaze without hesitation. "You are here because you made a decision most people would not," he said, and she held that for a second, letting it settle fully before nodding once, decisive now. "Then I will do it," she said, not with excitement, not with relief, but with a quiet certainty that felt stronger than either. And for the first time, Alexander allowed a faint smile to appear, not polished, not calculated, but real. Weeks later, the same plaza where everything had started looked different, not in structure, but in atmosphere. Small changes that most people would not notice, but that mattered in ways that could not be measured on a balance sheet. Employees trained differently, security instructed to approach with respect instead of assumption, and near the entrance, a simple framed note hung discreetly by the information desk, a reminder of a principle that now guided decisions at every level. And as Sophia walked through the space, her step steady, her posture confident in a way that came from purpose rather than appearance, she paused for just a moment, her eyes catching her reflection again in the glass. But this time she did not question whether she belonged, because she knew she did, not